Hello, everyone. My name is Debi Wong, and I'm the founding artistic director of Renaissance Opera. Renaissance Opera, myself and my two colleagues, Conrad Sly and Brian Topp, are located on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish peoples. Mireille Asselin is on Treaty 27 territory and on the traditional territories of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe peoples. If you are uncertain of the lands that you are presently located on, take a moment to pop your address into native-land.ca. I believe the link will be shared with you. And if you're curious to know more about the peoples and the stewards of the lands that our presenters are on, please do explore the other links that should be shared right now as well. Thank you so much to OperaCon for having us. Thank you to Musique Trois Femmes and Opera 5, hosted by Opera McGill. Thank you all so much. We are excited to share our journey with Orpheus VR and our creation process with you. Orpheus VR is a new operatic experience in virtual reality that places a single audience member at the center of a reimagined and interactive version of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth. Think choose your own adventure meets epic opera. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history and inspiration of the project, and then I will hand over to my three other presenters and three colleagues on our core team to talk about their process and their experiences with the opera so far. We are a team of 8 artists creating Orpheus VR, and with me are Brian Topp, our music director and interactive composer. There you go. Actually, maybe say hi, Brian, so people can see you.
Hey everyone, I'm Brian.
Hi, Brian. We have Conrad Sly, our art director.
Hey everyone, I'm Conrad.
And Mireille Asselin, who plays the role of Eurydice.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yay. I was told that there would be a lot of opera people in this talk today. I hope that's the case because I am not going to bother rehashing the birth of Western opera or citing the Grove Anthology of Music, but I did want to take this moment to give you my version of the history of the birth of Western opera because it's relevant to our project. So we are often taught that we are often taught about the history of music through the lens of specific composers. But Western opera actually exists because of an extensive interdisciplinary and collaborative effort undertaken by a cohort of rebellious artists and thinkers who were more or less disgruntled with the state of dramatic storytelling in the 16th century. Inspired by Greek theatrical practices, Western opera emerged from a process of ideating, innovating, and prototyping, all in the name of reconnecting with powerful modes of storytelling. Even though Western opera was born with the intent to reclaim historical art forms, what emerged was an unprecedented form of storytelling that leveraged modern ideas and technologies to immerse audiences in epic stories. And that is essentially what we are hoping to do with Orpheus VR. We are exploring new ideas, leveraging new technologies, and trying to open up new forms of storytelling. There are two big questions that sort of have inspired and govern our creative process and our ideas. And the first is, what would opera look like and feel like if it were invented today? And what is essential to our understanding of opera, and how can technology innovate the audience experience of those essentials? So we are using 3 kinds of we're using lots of different technologies, but the 3 main ones that I want to talk to you about today and that we're all going to kind of dive into are the first being virtual reality. And virtual reality, we chose this technology because it has the ability to truly immerse audience members in completely different worlds. Much like music does for us when we're in the opera, we have the ability to kind of drown in the musical and atmospheric world. We wanted our visual experience of the story to do the same. So we chose to work in the virtual reality medium. This does mean headsets and controllers, and the headsets, I will admit, are still a bit clunky, but we're still really excited to be exploring this emergent and nascent storytelling form. The second is interactive audio. And music, of course, is a cornerstone of this whole experience and drives the narrative in here. But we, in addition to putting the user inside of the operatic experience, we wanted them to feel like they were co-creators in the experience and have the ability to actually affect the way the story unfolds, which in the context of an opera means affecting the way the music unfolds. So interactive audio in our experience means that anything you do has musical consequences. You have the option to object or you have the option to choose different narrative paths, and that means it will change the sequence of arias and songs and music that you hear, kind of becoming a co-creator in your own operatic experience, which Brian will talk about a bit later. The other technology is motion capture. If you are an opera fan, you will know how integral and special and amazing our performers are. And we wanted to be able to maintain the integrity and the subtlety of live performers, real performers, and their expressions from both their body and their face. And so what motion capture means is that we are essentially recording the full body movements and facial movements of and vocal, of course, movements of our singers, so that the characters you see inside the experience are very much played by real performers. Instead of wearing a fancy operatic costume, they are wearing a fancy avatar. So I will show you a little clip of how all of these ideas are sort of coming together, and then I'm going to hand over to Conrad Sly, our art director, to tell you about building those costumes or avatars and building our environment, or in traditional opera terms, our set.
I should have known you'd find me. We can't ever escape the fates. I know you guard Eurydice in this grove. Let me show you that our love is true.
Welcome to the mortal world. That is Orpheus here, searching for Eurydice who sleeps in the willow grove.
There is a song in the heart of the earth that echoes in our beings. It sings when you brush the branches of the willow tree. It rings out when the moonflower blooms.
Together, they could move mountains, roil the sea, change the course of destiny.
So I will hand over to Conrad Sly, our art director, to talk to you about how we've built the characters and the environment and the inspiration behind the characters. Conrad.
All right, thank you, Debbie. All right, so when Debbie and I initially started talking about wanting to try to make a VR opera experience, we wanted to explore using VR tools to create our storyboards and like early concepts for both the characters and the environments. And my background is actually in architecture visualization, so this was like really fun and exciting for me, like new territory. So creating 3D models in VR is a really fun way to do something a bit more physical than using and intuitive than using a mouse and keyboard. You have a much greater idea of what it's going to be like to inhabit the set because you're actually in the set when you're making it. Like you can build a tree and place it directly in front of you, and you can sort of model a set in that sense to get a real idea of what the player is going to experience. So with that in mind, you can like sort of strategize ways of building a set that are going to be efficient so that you don't have to spend unnecessary time building stuff that's not going to be used. We explored using a bunch of VR content creation tools to do this, early concepting of these kinds of assets, but it became pretty clear to us towards the end of the phase that the kinds of assets you can create with VR content creation tools right now, they're not really suitable for mobile VR platforms quite yet. The pipeline for optimizing them it's still not quite there yet. So we had to fall back to traditional methods to create the production quality assets. So to speak a little bit more about the design process for the characters, next slide, please. We drew a lot of inspiration from Greek myths, opera, games, and so on, and put our own spin on it. For Eurydice, she's typically a damsel in distress, but we wanted to empower her role in our storyline, making her like a strong-willed dryad with deep roots. So our version of the story for Orpheus and Eurydice is going to feature some branches or story options for the player that deviate from these stereotypes of the myths and many versions of the myths. And we wanted to make sure Eurydice was appealing to a contemporary audience. Next slide, please. For Orpheus, we stylized him with bird-like features to emphasize his musical and whimsical nature. In this concepting stage of our production, we didn't want to use any props, thinking that it would be simpler in terms of motion capture and animation to do without them. So we integrated elements of Orpheus's musical instrument, his lyre, into his costume design. So the strings will appear on his blouse and forearms and cuffs, and there may be moments in the animations where he is strumming his clothing or something like that. It became clear to us that it'd be great to have some help to polish some of my initial character designs into production quality concept art. So we hired an amazing character designer here in Vancouver. Her name's Dorothy Yang, and she helped breathe more life into these characters and brought them up to a higher standard. So we're gonna play a short clip showing the different stages of Eurydice's concepts with one of her songs by Brian, our audio director. All right, so once this concepting phase was more or less wrapped up, it was my job to start building the characters in 3D to be used in Unity. So we used a program called Character Creator, which has pre-built character rigs that are ready for motion capture right from the outset. And this was really big for us because we didn't have the capacity or know-how for setting up those kinds of production quality character rigs for motion capture. So it was great not to have to worry about that. From there, we could modify and stylize the characters towards art style that would be suitable for mobile devices, which is like quite a stylized art style. And then we can paint those characters and costumes of the characters before we send them to our project in Unity. And almost every asset has to go through this kind of pipeline before it is staged in our virtual reality set. Next slide, please. So here you can start to see some of these things coming together. Like various different things like his Orpheus's costume, the way his hair is made. Interesting things about the hair is that we can animate individual strands of the hair when we get to that point of our production where we need to start polishing those kinds of things. Next slide, please. And as you can see here with Orpheus, as we like to call him sometimes, things don't always quite work out as expected with these tools, but they're made with this speed of iteration in mind. So what's great about some of the tools that we're using is that with the skilled animator that we have on our team, his name is Neil, we're able to very quickly, rapidly iterate on some of the motion capture data sets that we get, and able to clean up sort of unforeseen hiccups that may happen, like you see here. All right, next slide, please. And so for the environment, we started out by sketching a map and using a lot of stock assets available in certain like asset stores and stuff like that. So that we could really quickly start prototyping some of the interactions and pacing of how we want the experience to work, while I, in the background, am creating our own unique set design assets. So sketching things out early is really important so that we have a lot of time to iterate and make decisions about story beats, about pacing, about interactions, and bug fixing is really important as well. Next slide, please. So yeah, here we can see just a quick preview of the map, or sort of was our rough plan of how we wanted things to work, but it changed rapidly over time, along with some of the photo bashed concept images of how like the look and feel and mood we wanted to have in the environment. Next slide, please. So Debi had written a really wonderful backstory for the characters and creatures in the story, including the forces and gods and fates behind the scenes pulling the strings in the story. So for example, here we have some of these symbols were designed to represent the forces of the fates. We have chaos, the weaver, prophecy, destruction, and these are all like the prime movers of the events that lead up to Orpheus and Eurydice's story. So we wanted to tell this backstory through world building and environmental storytelling in the set in fun ways with subtle interactions that the player can discover. And once again, we relied heavily on our talented artist, Dorothy, to help us flesh out some of those story beat ideas. And here you can start to see some of these things coming together in the world, and it's all still work in progress, so nothing here is final yet. But at this point, I can hand it off to Mimi to talk a little bit more about what it's like to inhabit one of these virtual avatars.
Okay, thanks, Conrad. So today I'm here to speak a little bit to the performer's experience in working in virtual reality. As I think many of you watching are, I trained in opera and sort of standard opera through all of my schooling, did all of the sort of the rigorous training that goes along with that, and really honed sort of what it is to perform in large spaces in a proscenium format. Proscenium means that you're working on a stage and then you have what we call the fourth wall, which is that invisible wall that is the audience that we perform out to. And so we have developed over the years this really strong instinct to how do I tell a story with my body, with my voice, not only on a large scale, so it projects far in terms of not only vocally, textually, but with our body language. How does that read from far away? And how do I make sure that I'm always visible and I'm highlighting aspects of the storytelling with my body so that I'm not pulling attention from my colleague who should have the spotlight at any given moment? Or how do I direct attention to the right things for the audience member as they're watching an opera? So that was the main difference in attacking virtual reality that I found really, really fascinating, and brought all of these kinds of intuitive things that I had trained to sort of hone over the years back into question, and sort of how do we tell the story? How do we act in this new space and be true to opera, but take advantage of everything that virtual reality has to offer? So to begin, I'll just sort of maybe give you a little backstory on the traditional operatic approach to the Orpheus story. I've been lucky enough to perform in 3 different versions of the Orpheus myth. On the slides you can see on the left, that's a shot from Gluck's version of Orpheus as arranged by Berlioz, actually. So it has sort of multiple hands in the pot. And that was a more modern adapted production, as you can see. And then on the right, on the top, we have Monteverdi's Orfeo, which is actually considered to be the very first opera ever written. So I think it's really cool that it's now the first virtual reality opera as well in this format. I think that's very poetic. And then on the bottom is a version of Charpentier's Orphée, la descente d'Orphée aux enfers. So it's one of the most popular stories, I think, for opera. It's been told and retold multiple times. The general gist of the story is Orpheus is a demigod who is the son of a muse. He is very gifted at song and at playing the lyre. And he and Eurydice are very much in love. Some versions of the myth have them married. Some versions, it's on their wedding day that she's bitten by a snake and dies. And in his grief, he sings and sort of breaks everyone's heart. And he's encouraged to go to the underworld and beg for her to be returned to him because their love is so pure. And that's what he does. He goes to the underworld. He sings to Hades and Persephone. He plays his lyre, and he softens their hearts to such an extent that they allow him to return with his wife, Eurydice, under the condition that he is not allowed to look back over his shoulder as he's leaving the underworld to make sure that she's following him. And traditionally, the story is that just as he's getting back to the surface, he turns to make sure that she's with him. But of course, she has not emerged yet, and then she is sucked back into the underworld. Certain versions, like on the left, the version by Gluck and Berlioz, has a character of love, Amor, that sort of takes pity on them and brings her back to life, and they do sort of live happily ever after. So it's a story that has a great tradition of being kind of rewritten and adapted to suit whatever the current storyteller's vision is of this myth. And it's very enduring. It's the power of song, the power of love and of music. And I think it's a perfect thing to bring into this new world. Generally, the process, Debbie, you can go to the next slides, thanks. Very similar to opera. Start with music, you go to blocking, and then the show happens. In our case, that was mocap capture. Or I guess that's, I don't have to say mocap capture, do I? It's motion capture, mocap. So in our case, the music recording happened right out of the gate. It was great to work with Brian, sort of virtually to find just the right keys for everything to fit our voices. Always so great to work with fantastic living composers where you can do that. We went straight into the studio to record, and actually took a couple different takes in different keys, as I remember, because we were still playing around with how the story was going to branch and how the audio was going to link from one scene to another and which keys might work better. So that was kind of interesting. We were able to play with that. And Brian had not, he sort of took our audio and then later orchestrated it, which I'll let him describe to you. But so the audio recording was actually totally a cappella. We didn't have an idea of what the sound world was going to be, which was really kind of amazing to hear it all come together after the fact. But the first thing out of the gate was just putting down the voice track. Then Debbie and I kind of went away. And as you can see in those pictures where there's sort of a hardwood floor and Debbie's wearing the virtual reality headset, we sort of tried to block out these scenes as best we understood them to have to happen in a world in which we had no idea what the parameters were. So that was a really fun week of just, okay, so Conrad's told us that I need to come alive out of a tree at this moment. So what does that actually mean? Like, what are the parameters physically of, what can I do that's going to work with the animation? And not coming from that background at all, we relied quite heavily on Conrad's input over those days. we would call him all the time and say, hey, if I want to do this, is that going to work? Hey, if when the world cracks open, like, how far apart do we have to be? How do we get there? Like, what should we do to help you tell this story? So it was really collaborative. And, we came up with some basically mock-ups, some drafts of what we thought would work. And we brought that into the mocap studio, which you can see sort of at the in the center there. That's us in our mocap outfits with the tiny little sensors. And I'll have Debi go to the next slide and sort of show you a little bit about how that all worked. So as I said, one of the most challenging things, or the coolest things about reimagining this, was blowing out the notion of a proscenium stage and realizing that the person experiencing the story, we would have absolutely no control as to how they experienced the story as we told it, because and I have yet to use the headset and see how this all works, so I still don't really understand how I interact with the audience. But it was so cool to sort of think, okay, I'm having this intimate moment with Debi, who's playing Orpheus. Perhaps the user is going to be like looking over my shoulder at her. Perhaps they're going to be walking around. Perhaps they're going to be far away. And so it was really about sort of unlearning a lot of the theatrical notions that I had drilled into me. And it wasn't even like TV or movies where where your camera angle is coming from. I really had no idea where my camera angle was. I just had to be myself in the moment and trust that the user would take away what they took away from the storytelling. But there were aspects of, okay, this is Debi's scene, so I'm going to make sure that I'm not, doing anything too big gesturally, that the user is going to want to look at me instead of her in that moment. So that was one of the really great sort of exercises mentally and imaginatively to bring this to life. And another parameter are the suits that we were working with, which were quite flexible, but they had these little ping pong balls that were sort of Velcroed to us. And so actually we had to be quite careful in terms of how we interacted together. A hug is not just a hug. You have, like, how does your motion translate into the avatar to make it look good, but also not disturb this finely calibrated technology? If I hit one of her ping pong balls, we might need to take 20 minutes to reset and recalibrate the whole set, the whole sort of space we were working in. And then all of the tech people who knew what they were doing were like, you just rolled on, I remember quite vividly having a hard time with the placement of a mocap ball on our hands, so that it was just the right angle, so that when we moved it, it understood what the motion of the hand was and what the angle of the hand would be. And we played with that quite a bit. So yeah, it was just this really great, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's still a total mystery as to, like, I'm sure I will learn a lot about what worked and what didn't work, about the solutions we came up with when I experienced the final product, because it's a world that I haven't been in yet. And I think that it was a really, really great sort of first kick at the can, but we're going to definitely take away a lot of knowledge as to what works, what doesn't work, and what to do better the next time when we get back in studio again. And I believe that Debi has a little clip here, speaking of the coming out of the tree moment of Eurydice. So let's watch what they have. Thank you.
Orpheus, Orpheus. Orpheus, what have you done?
All right, so I guess I'll take over. Thank you, Mimi. So I'm Brian. I am the composer and audio designer for Orpheus VR. And I could probably talk for hours about the music, but I've been told not to do that. So I'm just going to talk about some of the interesting challenges and things that we face when developing the music to this. So maybe next slide. So the music itself actually lifts a lot from the original Monteverdi's L'Orfeo. There's a lot of melodic quotes. There's a lot that we've kind of based directly off of that, particularly with his use of very modal harmonic vocabulary. It appears a bit more kind of modern cinematic in what I've done, but I drew a lot of inspiration from sort of the original score. And as Debi said, one of our goals was to have the user actually interact with the story, become part of the story, and thusly, they help shape the musical experience. And one of the challenges with this is that, this as a project really sort of sits in between, an opera and how that gets put together, and something that more closely resembles a video game where you have a character or a player and they're doing things, they're interacting, and that brings in a lot of challenges. Can I get the next slide? So one of the challenges is that, if you think about how a traditional opera might be put together, you would have your libretto and your music, and you kind of compose this whole thing up front, and then you worry about staging and costumes and all this stuff much later. But for a project like this, you're essentially moving a whole bunch of mountains a couple inches at a time, because the size of the world will dictate how much time it takes to move through it, and where the characters are placed. There's a lot of variables that tie together the art and the world design and what the user can do, and a lot of variables. And one of the big difficulties is that as soon as you start having interaction and choice from the user, time becomes a very flexible thing. We're asking the user to interact with some kind of object, or follow Orpheus through a section, or make certain decisions. And that means that you can't really rely on, or you never really know exactly how long that will take, when they'll make the choices, or what choices they'll make. And this kind of it's sort of counterintuitive to what music is, in that most music exists pretty strictly in time. Music relies on structure and pacing and rhythm, and any moment that feels as good as it does in a piece is the result of everything that has led up to it, with tension and release and whatnot. And once timing becomes flexible, you have to start thinking about those things in different ways. So the music, in a lot of ways, sorry, Debbie, can I get you to go back? So in many ways, the music was actually informed by, at any moment, what is the user doing? So there's some things that are fixed. So the motion capture performances are fixed. The timing doesn't change, because that's solidified in the mocap. But then there are also moments where things are very free. So, where you're moving through the world, or where, we're asking you to sort of do things or play around with elements of the world. And then there are also sections that are very user directed, where the player is consciously making decisions. And one of the things with the musical score is we try to reinforce those decisions with some kind of musical result. As you're doing something, you're hearing the world around you change. So now we'll get the next slide. And this brings up the idea of dynamic music. So, the music having to be conceived of or designed in such a way that it can change and evolve in real time. And so some of the techniques that we're actually using, like Mimi was saying, having to record the vocal lines a cappella, really what we sort of did with that is write out these vocal lines and have some kind of harmonic framework that we're working in. But orchestration and all that comes much, much later, because a lot of the pieces actually exist as, okay, here's the piece, and there are maybe 9, 10, 15 different layers or orchestrations that could make up that piece. And based off of the decisions, the piece will change or will morph in the direction of that. Essentially, throughout the opera, you can choose whether you want to help Orpheus or you want to hinder him. And so the music actually reflects that. So in some cases, as you're helping him, the music might become much brighter, might become much richer in harmony. As you choose to hinder him, the orchestration gets darker and darker, just to sort of reflect sort of the morality of those decisions. And we also have dynamic branching. So the story does branch as you make decisions. You know, what unfolds next is largely decided by that. So there are certain paths that you can take where your musical experience is one thing, but if a user makes different decisions, they'll actually hear completely different arias and recits, sort of in response to how they want to shape the world. Next slide. And so just a little bit of an example, we're going to play a short video here in a moment, but talking about like some of the ways that the piece can be kind of constructed. This is the opening scene. This is some of the dynamic layering. So the scene actually starts, it's all done with like a large string orchestra. And so it starts, you know, we're hearing kind of a middle range sort of string part. And eventually there's a vocal layer that comes in that is Orpheus, which follows Orpheus. You actually kind of hear it connected to the character. And you're told about your powers. So you have the ability to breathe life into the world and to take life away. And so there's a number of different sort of musical gestures that come into it. As you breathe life into the world, there's a reactive flourish so that you immediately know, okay, I've done some kind of action. And then there are a number of other layers that can get added. So as you continue to breathe life into the world, the music actually builds upward, and it's very bright. It's very, there's a lot of little flourishes and tremolando things that give it this kind of whimsical feeling. And as you take life away, music actually expands downwards. So the harmonies become richer. We sort of build out the bottom range there. And the idea is, you know, once you leave the shrine, you're kind of left with this musical composition that you kind of follow through the rest of that kind of section. Next slide. And just because this is my artistic ability, but this is just a little bit of a graph that kind of shows that layering. So our middle layer in green, singing over top of it, and then sort of how the music expands outwards based off of the decisions that you make. And one of the real challenges with this is that there's a really great ability to make music that evolves. But the hardest part is trying to write music that is in 9, 10, 15 layers that doesn't eventually just turn into a wall of noise. So a lot of these layers actually sneak in. They're very sparse. They're very, you know, they're not immediately like, okay, I touch a flower and then, okay, here's a big violin solo or anything, which is why we also have those flourishes, because you have to, you know, let the user know that they're actually doing stuff. So I think, yeah, I'll send it back to Debbie, but please ask questions about the music. There's a lot going on with this. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Mimi, and thank you, Conrad. We are really excited to finally show part of our prototype. So just everyone sort of alluded to a bit of the story, but in our experience, you play the role of fate. And as the role of fate, you have the option, as Brian said, to breathe life into the world or take it away. And as you navigate the story, you discover Orpheus and Eurydice, our two main characters, and you find out that they are in love and want to be together, but it would mean upsetting the power balances in the world as they exist presently. And as you go through the story, you get to decide whether you want to destroy the power balances and the forces in the world and allow Orpheus and Eurydice to be together and possibly let a new world order emerge, or you can decide to prevent Orpheus and Eurydice from being together and maintain the world balance as it presently exists. So we are going to play you, this is a video recording from inside the headset, And it's the opening sequence where you are learning a little bit about the history and you discover Orpheus. So here is our prototype for the first few minutes.
Welcome to the mortal world. In this place, we are prophecy. We are fate. We balance the forces of life and death. Under our right hand, nature awakens. Under our left hand, nature sleeps. Such is our right. We are incarnations of destiny, and we have come here for a reason. Listen, that is Orpheus, searching for their love Eurydice, who sleeps in the middle grove, under our watchful eye. We must follow Orpheus. In this mortal realm, Orpheus holds the power of a god, Eurydice, the force of a nymph. Together they could move mountains, roil the sea, upset the balance of destiny, a power that belongs only to the fates. Go, follow Orpheus. Keep them apart.
Thank you all so much. That is our presentation. You can follow our work on reopera.com or orpheusvr.ca. I saw that there is one other question, so I'll get to that in 2 seconds here. I just wanted to thank OperaCon again for having us. Thank you to Musique Trois Femmes and to Opera 5 and Opera McGill for hosting us. Renaissance Opera is also running Indie Fest right now. You can check out the rest of our programming at indiefest2020.ca. And I will answer this question very quickly. The economics about mocap and VR. Yeah, actually, one of the things, you can message us about this, but one of the parameters we placed on this project was that because Renaissance is an indie opera company, we wanted to work with very specific tools, some of which Conrad has talked about, but I told him not to go too crazy on the technical specs. But we are trying to use tools that allow us to work quickly and have clear pipelines that don't require huge programming teams or really expensive equipment. We did pair with the Sawmill Studios, who allowed us, who really supported us with their research and development department to develop pipelines and processes to do this kind of work. So we are not working with a AAA video game budget. We are still working very much within an indie budget, which does create challenges too, but we are all really happy with what we've been able to accomplish so far. And the more testing and iterating we do, the easier it becomes, sort of.
Yeah, can I chime in a little bit on that one?
Please do. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, so the technologies are becoming more and more accessible. You can do face motion capture of the human face now with an iPhone. So it's becoming more and more available. I think we'll start to see more affordable options that can produce high quality results coming out in the next 3 to 4 years. Yeah, and a huge shout out to Neil, our animator. Happy birthday, Neil. It's his birthday. Yeah, so without his help and expertise, we wouldn't have been able to get as far as we have for sure. And the sawmill as well.
Yeah. Thank you all so